Thank you, Dr. Wood. We will now welcome Dr. Shermer to the podium.
Can you hear me all right if I walk around just a little bit? Thank you, David. Thank you, Ratio Christus and Kennesaw State. Good to see you all. I need to unplug the defibrillator here before I actually start my opening statement. But first, just curiosity of show of hands, how many of you believe in God? Holy shit. Look at the time. Oh, boy. Wow. Well, I used to be a Christian. I used to be a believer in God, a theist. I was an evangelist. I went door to door, witnessing to people. We called it Amway with Bibles. And then later I became an atheist, a sort of a born-again atheist, and I went back to those same doors and take it all back. I was wrong. And then I became a militant agnostic, like the bumper sticker says, I don't know and you don't either. But then, see, the problem is the terms. The terms are loaded. Theist just means you believe in God. Atheist, you just lack a belief in God. But there are strong atheists who believe that they can prove that God doesn't exist or show that it very likely doesn't exist. Or weak atheists that just lack a belief in God and just sort of leave it at that. Agnostic is actually a term I used for a while. It was coined by Thomas Huxley in 1869 just to mean that God is unknowable in any scientific, rational sense. It's just an article of faith and nothing more. But then when I was on the Colbert Report, Stephen told me in the green room when he asked me about my religious beliefs that an agnostic is just an atheist without balls. So I thought, well, come on, Shermer. So, now I'm a skeptic because that's the name of my magazine. But really, it's just, I think it's very unlikely that there is a God. We can't prove that there is nothing. Can't prove a negative. But just follow a thought experiment here for a second. Over the last, say, about 10,000 years, humans have created about 10,000 different religions and about 1,000 different gods. What is the probability that Yahweh, the God that David believes in, is the one true God, and that Amun-Ra, Aphrodite, Apollo, Baal, Brahma, Ganesha, Isis, Mithras, Osiris, Shiva, Thor, Vishnu, Wotan, Zeus, and the other 986 gods are all false gods? Do I have any believers in any of the gods I just read off? I have one taker. Which one? Zeus, yes, all right. So, like me, the rest of you are all atheists. Some of us just go one God further. It's a pretty simple idea. That's the trend in the history of science, is to go in that direction. But even if David convinced you that the arguments are in favor of God's existence, this doesn't prove that Yahweh is the right God. It could be one of these other gods. If you decide that the reason and evidence points to a God, it could be one of these other gods. It could be an extraterrestrial intelligence, as I wrote about in Scientific American. How do you know? Okay, now I'm going to go off the page and just respond a little bit to the defibrillator argument, as it were. It's irrelevant, the religion of the scientists who pioneered science. Some of this was correct, some of it not quite. It's a little more subtle than that. I'm a historian of science, but it's like saying, all the great art in medieval Europe was done by Christians. All the great music was done by Christians. Everybody was a Christian. It was almost against the law in some countries to not be a Christian. So who was going to do the music? Who was going to do the art? Who was going to do the science? In any case, it's irrelevant. You might as well say that they were all dog owners. So what? It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. As for atheism, atheism isn't a thing. It's just a lack of belief in God. That's it. Full stop. I'm also an A Bigfootist. I'm an A UFOist. I'm an I was going to say Trumpist or something, but I didn't really get politics in there. It's not a belief system. There's no set of tenets. This is what atheists believe. It's just what we don't believe. We just don't believe in God, full stop, that's it. Now let's talk about something else. If you don't believe in God, but you believe in, say, civil rights, civil liberties, human rights, women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, you believe that people should be treated equally under the law, and so on and so forth, you're probably a humanist or a secular humanist or an Enlightenment humanist, but it's irrelevant. You can be a Christian and believe all those things. You can be an atheist and believe all those. It doesn't matter. So this is a complete non sequitur. This is not an argument for anything because there is no atheist worldview. All right. Now, on a point of logic, the burden of proof is on David to prove the existence of God, not on me to disprove the existence of God. I can't disprove Apollo and Zeus and all that. But we can sort of shade our probabilities of belief by the accumulative evidence for or against the God hypothesis. There is no atheist hypothesis. That isn't a thing. Either you think there's evidence for God or you don't. And there's no alternative to that has to be defended. All of these arguments, by the way, look like this. God, X looks created, whatever it is, the eye, the universe, planets, DNA. I can't think of how X was created naturally, therefore X was created supernaturally. This was, in essence, the argument he was making by rattling off all the scientists, Tycho Brahe, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and so on. You know, they ran up against certain mysteries in their fields and said, well, I can't figure it out. I guess God did it. Newton has a famous quote. I'm surprised that my intelligent design creationist friends don't use this quote, in which he talks about the stunning alignment of all the planets in this flat plane, the plane of the ecliptic, which all the planets are going around in the same direction. They're all in this flat plane except for Pluto, which is no longer a planet, so it's not a problem. And he says, it's just I can't explain, I can't figure out how this could have come about. This must have been the providence of the divine creator. But no one makes that argument anymore, which is why my intelligent design creationist friends don't use that quote, because we now have a cogent theory for how solar systems are formed. Naturally. All you need is gravity and some stuff, and certain right configurations of how far apart they are and so on, and planets naturally form. We now know that virtually every star in the galaxy has a planet. Completely natural. You don't have to have an intervening God to step in to stir the particles to make that happen. In the long history of science, this is what happens. People invoke the gap. They say, well, I can't think of how this could have come about naturally, therefore it must have been supernaturally. The gaps are being filled. That's what scientists do. And their graduate students especially. That's what graduate students are for, to fill gaps. And eventually, those gaps will be filled, and then where goes your religious faith? If you hook your faith to there's this gap here, these guys can't explain this thing here, whatever it is, the fine-tunedness of the cosmos, DNA, the eye, whatever. You can't explain that I'm hooking my, he explained it. Everyone accepts it. Happened naturally. Now what? Now what do I do with my faith? Okay, that's the problem. In any case, if you invoke the God hypothesis, there's a creator did all this. Any being capable of designing particles, atoms, molecules, DNA, protein chains, cells, organisms, planets, stars, and universes can't be simple. Such a being would have to be as complex as, or more complex than her creations. Thus, by all theistic arguments for God's existence, there must be a God's God who created the Christian God. And if you continue to make that argument, then there has to be a God's God that made the Christian God ad infinitum. Now, you can't just say, well, you got to stop the causal chain somewhere, and I'm stopping it at my God. Why? You're the one who initiated the argument that there has to be a designer behind the complex system. So, who designed the designer? Well, the designer is that which does not need to be created. Why can't the universe be that which does not need to be created? Because the universe is a thing and it has to be created. Well, maybe God is a thing. No, God is not a thing. God is an agent. I'm an agent. You think I was created. So therefore, God would need to be created. And so forth. So that's the problem with all those arguments. Now I'm going to make two arguments tonight against the idea that there's a God and in favor of the idea that we invented God. The biggest problem I see for atheists is the problem of evil. So pick two. 1, God is all-powerful. 2, God is all good. 3, evil exists. You can have 2 of those. You can't have all 3. Here's a few numbers for you. According to UNICEF, about 29,000 children under the age of 5 die each day, mainly from preventable causes. That's 21 dead children every minute, 10.6 million a year. That's the equivalent of a Holocaust every year. More than 70% of these 10.6 million children deaths every year are attributable to 6 causes: diarrhea, malaria, neonatal infection, pneumonia, preterm delivery, or lack of oxygen at birth. Science's response is, well, give them those things. Religion's response is, those are part of God's plan. Really? What kind of plan is that? What kind of God, who is all-powerful and all good, would not stop that? Now, I'm not talking about homicides, gang warfare, civil wars, and strife in Syria. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about innocent children who have no free will. They're not freely choosing to die from horrible diseases and cancer. Why would God allow that to happen? An all-powerful, all-good God? A less than powerful or not so good God? Or no God at all? The problem with explaining evil for religious people, for theists, is what I call the irrefutable God problem. When good things happen, who gets the credit? God did it. He works in wonderful ways. He's answered my prayers. He made a miracle. When bad things happen, who gets the blame? Not God. Or, he works in mysterious ways, don't you know? What does that even mean? So no matter what happens, the God hypothesis is confirmed. What would disconfirm the God hypothesis? Good things happen, so God is. Bad things happen, so God is. What would have to happen to refute this causal explanation of evil? In the Christian worldview, nothing can refute it. It's irrefutable. It's a simple assertion. It's true by asserting, I hereby say it's true. And that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, as the great late Christopher Hitchens once said. One of my favorite examples comes from my friend, the late great Carl Sagan. I call it Sagan's Dragon. He has a chapter in his book, The Demon Haunted World, called I Have a Dragon in My Garage. I have a dragon in my garage. Would you like to see it? It's really cool. You open the garage door, you look in. I see some paint cans, a ladder, a bicycle. I don't see a dragon. It's an invisible dragon. Oh, an invisible dragon. Yeah. Well, I got some infrared cameras here. We can detect the body heat of the invisible dragon. Well, you see, this dragon is a cold-blooded dragon. It doesn't give off any heat at all. I have some spray paint. We'll spray the... No, it doesn't stick. It's non-corporeal body. We'll put some flour on the floor, and then when it walks around, we can see its footprints. Well, you see, this dragon hovers above the ground about 3 feet. The fire-breathing dragons. I have some other equipment here that can measure fire. This is a special dragon. It has cold fire. Oh, cold fire. So Carl said, what's the difference between an invisible, floating, cold, undetectable, invisible dragon and no dragon at all? You say, well, but I feel the presence of the dragon's love. I feel it in my heart. That's nice. That doesn't mean there's a dragon there. We can imagine and conjure all sorts of things that make us feel good or bad. That doesn't mean the dragon's real. Yeah, but one time I prayed to the dragon and my headache went away. That's interesting, but, headaches do tend to go away after a couple of days. Take a couple aspirin. Well, but one time My relative got a cancer, and I prayed to the dragon, and the tumor went into remission. Yes, okay, that's getting more interesting, but tumors do go into remission occasionally. Not as often as we would like, but you do hear about these. So that's not really evidence for the dragon. It could be some other medical explanation. Well, but I'm just unsatisfied with the problem of evil, so I think the dragon makes evil things happen, and so on and so on. You get the point. What's the difference between an indetectable, invisible, cold God, whatever, and no God at all? This is the problem with the problem of evil. When you follow this line of reasoning, this is like playing baseball without the bases or the ball. This is like what I call the witch theory of causality. If your theory of evil, if your explanation for storms and disasters, plagues and diseases and accidents is that women cavort late at night with demons, then you're either insane or you lived 500 years ago in Christian Europe when everybody believed in the witch theory of causality. This was the Christian theory of evil. Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Today, no one in their right mind believes this. There's not a Christian in this room that believes this nonsense. Why? Because science debunked the witch theory of causality, as it has been debunking all of these religious theories of causality. Because religion has no method of testing hypotheses. It's the invisible dragon and nothing more. What's the Christian theory for all this? Ultimately, bad things happen because the fall in the garden, an original sin that we're born with because we've fallen away from God and thus we are free to sin and do evil. Yeah, but what about the children with the leukemia or the children dying? Well, God works in mysterious ways, don't you know? There's some reason for this. Just go back to those kids. Imagine you're a parent of one of these children who just dies right there. A preventable. God could have intervened at any moment, and He didn't. Why? What possible moral lesson are you supposed to draw from this? The solution to this evil, we are told, is to accept the sacrifice of the deity, which exonerates you from anything you did in your life, no matter how evil it might have been. Just think about that. You could be a serial killer on death row in Texas and find Jesus. This happens, don't you know? As it happens, I've read all 414 final statements of the executed prisoners in the state of Texas for a research project I'm doing. And about 90% of them found Jesus in prison. Not surprising, there's a big Christian ministry there. Are we to believe that these men, if they accept Jesus at the last moment, after the brutal crimes that they committed, they get to go, and Jews don't, Muslims don't, Native Americans never heard of Jesus before Europeans came here, they don't get to go? What about the 100 billion people that lived before us? Before Jesus, it was about 90 billion. They don't get to go to heaven. It's just the way it goes. Too bad. They didn't accept Jesus. This makes Christianity something of a cult of human sacrifice, but instead of the sacrifice of children or beasts of burden as practiced by primitive religions, it's the updated 2.0 version. The sacrifice of one child, the Son of God. This brings up my last point, my opening statement. So, David, I presume you are a monotheist. Christians are monotheists. God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and so forth. We were created sinless because God gave us free will. And Adam and Eve chose to eat from the tree of knowledge and so forth. We're born with original sin. Okay, first of all, this goes against all Western jurisprudence. You are responsible for your own sins, not anybody else's. And you are beholden and should be sorry to the people you harmed, not somebody else. Still, God could just forgive the sin we never committed, but instead he sacrificed his son Jesus, who is actually just himself in the flesh, because Christians are monotheists. So this violates the law of identity. A is A. A cannot be non-A at the same time. So the only way to avoid eternal punishment for sins we never committed from this all-loving God is to accept his Son, who's actually himself, as our Savior. So my final sentence. So God sacrificed himself to himself to save us from himself. This is barking mad. Thank you.
This is Blessed Man Meditations, where I like to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Some time ago, there was a debate between Michael Shermer and David Wood. In this video, I am taking notes on and responding to Michael Shermer's opening statement in the debate that he had with David Wood. I will begin by reading the notes from Michael Shermer's opening statement, and then I will take those notes and break them down and respond to them piece by piece. Shermer claims that a weak atheist lacks a belief in God. A strong atheist believes that they can prove God does not exist or prove that it is very likely that God does not exist. Agnostics believe God is unknowable in the scientific, rational sense. To agnostics, God is just an article of faith and nothing more. Shermer today calls himself a skeptic because he thinks it is very unlikely that there is a God. Shermer admits he cannot prove there's no God because he cannot prove a negative statement. Over the last 10,000 years, humans have created 10,000 religions and 1,000 different gods. Out of all those different gods, what is the probability that the Christian God is right while all the rest are wrong? Shermer says all of us are atheists when it comes to most gods. An atheist like Shermer just goes one God further. Even if a Christian apologist's arguments successfully convinced someone of the existence of a God, the arguments themselves aren't sufficient to prove that the Christian God is the one true God. It could be one of the other gods or an extraterrestrial intelligence. It is irrelevant that many of the founders of modern science were religious. Just like the history of art and music, the history of the world a couple centuries ago was dominated by Christians, so it isn't that big of a deal that modern science came to be on the heels of Christian belief. At that time, in some countries, it was against the law to not be a Christian. Therefore, the Christians had to lead the scientific disciplines. Atheism isn't anything else other than a lack of belief in a God. Shermer says there's no atheist worldview. Shermer says the burden of proof is on theists to prove God's existence, not on the atheist to disprove God's existence. The atheist can reduce the probability for belief in a God by the cumulative evidence against there being a God. There is no atheist hypothesis. Either you think there is evidence for a God, or you do not think there is evidence for a God. All theistic arguments look similar. Because theists can't think of a natural explanation for something, they default to a theistic explanation. In the long history of this world, this keeps happening. As science progresses, they discover answers to things that they previously did not know. That's what science does. Science keeps filling in gaps in our knowledge. Eventually, there will be no more gaps to fill. When science fills in all the gaps, there will be no more need for faith. If you invoke the God hypothesis, any being who could create all that there is cannot be simple. Any such being must be complex, as complex or more complex than the creation they have made. Because of the complexity of this deity, the God of Christianity must have been created. The biggest problem for theists is the problem of evil. God is all-powerful. Theists also say that God is all good. But theists then admit that evil exists. Shermer says that you can have two of those, but you cannot have all three. Shermer gives many real-life examples of how suffering in the world is an argument against God's existence. Shermer says that science can be the solution to the problems the world has because science can supply the things the world needs to help end suffering. Shermer says religion says suffering is part of God's plan. Shermer asks why God, who's all-powerful and all good, would not stop gratuitous suffering. Shermer says for God not to stop the suffering suggests that God is not all-powerful, not all good, or does not exist at all. Shermer says when good things happen, theists give God credit. Shermer says when bad things happen, theists don't blame God, or theists blow it away by saying God works in mysterious ways. Therefore, Shermer says, whether good happens or bad happens, the God hypothesis is confirmed for the theist. Shermer asks, what would disconfirm the God hypothesis? He says that nothing can refute the God hypothesis for theists. Shermer says, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Shermer makes up this dragon example and tries to strawman theists by submitting a dragon for God, or substituting a dragon for God. Shermer basically made the point that with the dragon example that many of the things that theists credit God for are things science eventually has figured out or will figure out. Shermer says faith in a God is like playing baseball without the bases or without the ball. This is like the witch theory of causality, Shermer asserts. Shermer says if your explanation for natural evil is the witch theory of causality, that women cavort with demons, then you lived 500 years ago. He cites Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, a command to kill witches. Today, no one believes in the witch theory of causality because science has debunked it. And science has been debunking religious theories of causality, Shermer says. Shermer says because religion has no method for testing hypotheses, it shouldn't be trusted. I guess he intimates that it shouldn't be trusted because it can't test hypotheses. Shermer says religion's the invisible dragon and nothing more. He says the Christian theory is that bad things happen because of the fall in the garden and of original sin. He said we're free to sin and free to do evil. He asks about children with incurable diseases. He says, where's God in that? He mocks Christians for their responses to things like child suffering. When God could have done something, but didn't, is he worth trusting, he asks. The solution, he says, is to accept the deity's sacrifice to exonerate you. He says you could be a serial killer on death row and find Jesus. He says several serial killers do find Jesus. Are we to believe that these killers, if they accept Jesus, that they're allowed to go to heaven, while there are those who are much better who don't accept Jesus, who don't go to heaven? He intimates that that's a problem. He suggests that people who lived before us, before the gospel was spread like it is now, who do not hear about Jesus, wouldn't get to go to heaven. He says this makes Christianity a cult of human sacrifice. He says, but Christians teach that instead of sacrificing children, Christ was the one that was sacrificed. He says the doctrine of original sin by Adam and Eve intimates that we are not responsible for our own sins. He says God could have just forgiven the sin, but instead sacrificed himself to himself. And others would say he sacrificed himself to himself for a weekend. Shermer says this violates the law of identity. So God sacrificed himself to himself to save us from himself. He says this is barking mad. That's the end of my notes from Shermer's opening statement. Now we'll take portions of it piece by piece and break it down in response to it and respond to it. So to begin with, to restate Shermer's statement, a weak atheist lacks a belief in God. A strong atheist believes they can prove God does not exist, or prove that it's very likely that God does not exist. Agnostics believe God is unknowable in the scientific rational sense. To agnostics, God is just an article of faith and nothing more. So here's my first response. It doesn't take a lot of faith to deduce that there must be a God when one considers the following. First, the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. Second, the design and fine-tuning found in the universe and on our planet that makes Earth uniquely suitable to contain life. Third, the existence of an absolute moral standard that most of us agree exists, even if we cannot clearly define it or explain its grounding in a way that we can all agree on. A simple way to look at it would be to understand that our normal everyday experience tells us that created things must have creators. Our phones, vehicles, and homes are just a few simple examples that most of us can relate to. Most of these things would be too complex for most of us to create using the materials we have. This means that it takes an incredible amount of intelligence to create these things that we take for granted. If it takes incredible intelligence to create these things that we take for granted every day, it's reasonable to assume that there's likewise intelligence behind our order, design, and the existence of our universe and our planet. Those three facts are evidence that is largely agreed upon to support that there must be a reason behind the order and design that we see. Is it more reasonable to assume that there's no intelligence behind this, or that there is intelligence behind this? The theist's opinion, based on our experience of the world around us, is that there is intelligence behind all that we see and experience. Random processes cannot produce things that show signs of intelligent design. Theists should not claim that they can prove God's existence. However, the theist can use the evidence that is available and make inferences to the best explanation, using evidence to arrive at an evidence-based conclusion that God is the best explanation for the reality that we experience. Monotheists can use many of the same arguments for God's existence. In other words, a Christian theist, a Jewish theist, and an Islam theist can use many of the same arguments for God's existence. Muslim theist. Shermer's next statement. Shermer today calls himself a skeptic because he thinks it's very unlikely that there's a God. Shermer admits he can't prove there's no God because he can't prove a negative statement. Here's my response to Shermer's statement. If it is very unlikely that there is a God, then there is no objective foundation for reality. We are little more than a cosmic accident. As Dawkins says about his own worldview, there is no meaning, no purpose, just blind, pitiless indifference. If there is no God, then there is nothing objectively wrong with me breaking into your home and stealing someone or something from you. Governments exist to stop crime. Crime is evildoers doing evil things. On Shermer's worldview, there is no evil, and government is not necessary if nothing is objectively wrong. It is a giant free-for-all, but people know that there is objective right and wrong. This is why governments exist, to stop the wrong from occurring. A theist should not claim they can prove God exists like I hear some do, but a theist can produce sound, reasoned, deductive arguments for why it is more reasonable for there to be a God behind everything. The next Shermer statement. Over the last 10,000 years, humans have created 10,000 religions and 1,000 different gods. Out of all those different gods, what is the probability, Shermer asks, that the Christian God is right while all the rest are wrong? Shermer is right that religion is man-made. The problem for atheists like Shermer is that Christianity is not a religion in the same sense that others are. Christianity has a basis in history. Christ affects all other cultures and religions. Other religions borrow from Christ, and Christ does not borrow from any of them. Not all of the other deities of the other religions have an historic basis. Other videos on my channel go into specifics about this. The whole book, Person of Interest, which I went through on my channel, has a lot to say about this. Shermer mischaracterizes and attacks Christianity and makes a straw man here. The video that you see on my channel below, the thumbnail for it, talks about how other religions borrow from Christianity and yet Christ borrows from none of them. So Shermer repeats the common misconception that many people make about Christianity. Even if some deities arrive before Christ in history, history shows that Christ did not borrow from any of them. He supersedes all of them. Shermer next says that all of us are atheists when it comes to most gods. An atheist like Shermer just goes one god further. So I looked up a Christian response to this specific objection. And Ed Fazer is one that I have heard Cameron Bertuzzi over on Capturing Christianity refer to a lot. And Ed Fazer on his blog says some things about this specific objection that you hear Shermer make. Fazer says, while your average internet infidel seems to regard the one God further objection as devastatingly clever, it is in fact embarrassingly inept, a sign of the extreme decadence into which secularist thought has fallen in the age of Dawkins. Suppose someone skeptical about Euclidean geometry said, when you understand why you regard all the particular triangles you've observed as having sides that are less than perfectly straight, you'll understand why I regard Euclidean plane triangles as such to have sides that are less than perfectly straight. Or suppose a critic of Platonism said, when you understand why you regard the things of ordinary experience as in various ways imperfect or less than fully good instances of their kind, you'll understand why I regard Plato's form of good as being less than fully good. Would you count these as devastating objections to Euclidean geometry and Platonism? Would they serve as fitting mottos for blogs devoted to common sense anti-Euclideism or common sense anti-Platonism? Obviously not. They would demonstrate only that the speaker didn't have the slightest clue what he was talking about. And so Ed Fazer is saying that because of that mathematical statement, he's deducing that the statement made by Shermer demonstrates that Shermer doesn't have the slightest clue what he's talking about. Fazer says the one God further objection is no better than these stupid objections would be. Fazer says the common sense anti-Euclidean objection supposes that the concept of a triangle as defined in textbooks of Euclidean geometry is merely one triangle alongside all the others that one comes across in traffic signs, dinner bells, and the like, only invisible and better drawn. But of course that's not what it is at all. What the textbooks describe is not a triangle, not even an especially well-drawn triangle, but rather Euclidean triangularity itself. And the triangles one comes across in everyday experience are defective, precisely because they fail to conform to the standard it represents. The common sense anti-Platonism objection supposes that the form of the good is merely one more or less perfect or imperfect instance of some class or category alongside the other instances, albeit an especially impressive one. But of course, that's not what it is at all. The form of the good doesn't have goodness in some more or less incomplete way. Rather, it just is goodness, participation in which determines the degree of goodness had by things which do have goodness only in some more or less incomplete way. Similarly, the common sense atheist, or one God further objection, supposes that the God of classical theism is merely one further superhuman being among others who have found worshippers, such as Thor, Zeus, Quetzalcoatl, and so forth. Only a superhuman being of even greater power, knowledge, and goodness than these other deities have. But of course, that's not what God is at all. He's not a being. He's not a being alongside other beings. Not even an especially impressive one, but rather being itself, or pure actuality. That form which all mere beings, including Thor, Zeus, Quetzalcoatl, if they existed, derive the limited actuality or existence they possess. Neither does God have power, knowledge, goodness, and the like. Rather, he is power, knowledge, and goodness, where the participation relation in Plato's theory of forms is translated by the classical theist into a relation between created things and their uncaused cause, in light of the doctrine of divine simplicity, and also thereby transformed by Thomists anyway into a kind of efficient causal relation. Note that the common sense anti-Platonist objection is a silly objection, whether or not one accepts Platonism and that the common sense anti-Euclidean objection would be a silly objection, whether or not one accepted Euclidean geometry. In the same way, the common sense atheist or one God further objection would be a silly objection, even if one had other grounds for rejecting classical theism. In all three cases, the objections represent a failure to understand or even the fundamentals of the position one is attacking. In other words, Shermer fails to understand the fundamentals of the position that he's attacking. It is no good replying that lots of ordinary religious people conceive of God in all sorts of crude ways, at odds with the sophisticated philosophical theology developed by classical theists, ways that make of God something like a glorified Thor or Zeus. The man on the street also believes all sorts of silly things about science, that Darwinism claims that monkeys gave birth to human beings, say, or that molecules are made up of little balls and sticks. But it would be preposterous for someone to pretend that he had landed a blow against Darwinism or modern chemistry by attacking these silly strongmen. But it would be preposterous for someone to pretend he had landed a blow against Darwinism or modern chemistry by attacking these silly strawmen. Similarly, what matters in evaluating classical theism is not what your grandpa or your Pastor Bob have to say about it, but whether what serious thinkers like Aristotle, Platonius, Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm Aquinas, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, and countless others have to say. Nor would it be any good to insist that the one God further objection is significant, at least as a reply to the more anthropomorphic theist personalist conception of God that has replaced the classical theist conception in the thinking of many modern theologians and philosophers of religion. For one thing, most theistic personalists, though they depart in significant and, in my view, disastrous ways from classical theism, are still committed to a far more sophisticated conception of God than purveyors of the one God further objection take as their preferred target. Comparing God to the flying spaghetti monster is not a serious reply to a theistic personalist like Plantinga or Swinburne. More importantly, purveyors of this objection take themselves to be presenting a serious criticism of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and philosophical theism as such, not merely of this or that modern representative of these views. And the historically mainstream tradition in these religions and in philosophical theology is classical theist, not theistic personalist. Hence, to fail to address the classical theist conception of God is ipso facto to fail seriously to address the claims of these traditions. In particular, unless one has made a serious study of philosophical theology as it's been developed within the Neoplatonic, Aristotelian, Thomistic, and other scholastic traditions, one's understanding of the traditional Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, not to mention philosophical theism, is simply infantile. Ed Feser masterfully says that Michael Shermer has a lot to learn. Needless to say, your typical internet infidel or new atheist is entirely innocent of knowledge of these traditions, nor is he much interested in finding out what they really have to say. He prefers to spend his time coming up with ever more elaborate rationalizations for refusing to find out. But like the Myers Shuffle, the secularist rationalization du jour, the one God further objection has this much going for it. It is an infallible indicator that one is not dealing with a serious or well-informed skeptic. The next thing Shermer says is that even if a Christian apologist's arguments successfully convinced someone of God's existence, the arguments aren't sufficient to prove that the Christian God is the one true God. Shermer says it could be one of the other gods or an extraterrestrial intelligence. In response, I say I agree with Shermer that it takes more to show that Christ is the true way to God. I agree that merely showing that God exists is insufficient to prove that Christianity is true. At the time of this recording, I had not listened to this debate. In fact, I still have not, just Shermer's opening statement. So I do not know what David said in his opening statement or how the debate went after Shermer's opening statement. The book Person of Interest by J. Warner Wallace goes to great lengths to show why Christ and not one of the other gods to which Shermer alludes is the one for us to trust. People like Shermer cite extraterrestrial intelligence many times because they're desperate to escape the theistic implications of what science has found pertaining to the fine-tuning or the beginning of everything. It's apparent that intelligence is required for life to exist. Atheists just don't want it to come from a God to whom they must be accountable. They want their freedom and think that by escaping God, they found true freedom. In reality, what they found is bondage to sin. Next, Shermer says it's irrelevant that many of the founders of modern science were religious. Just like the history of art and music, the history of the world a couple of centuries ago was dominated by Christians, so it isn't that big of a deal that modern science came to be on the heels of Christian belief. These are not direct quotes by Shermer in every case. These are summaries of the contents of what Shermer said. Please feel free to listen to the debate and know that I am trying to honestly, accurately represent the contents of Shermer's statements. To say, as Shermer does, that it's irrelevant that the founders of modern science were religious is inaccurate. It is incredibly relevant that the modern science founders were religious. Just because atheists like Shermer want to escape that fact because that fact hurts their image as supposed champions of science and reason does not make that fact that many of the founders of modern science were religious. It does not make that fact irrelevant. The fact that many founders of modern science were religious is very relevant. Atheist skeptics like Shermer want to make you think that it's irrelevant, so you will not consider its implications. As John Lennox says, because early scientists recognized that the universe and the earth as we know it were governed by constant laws and forces, they concluded there must be a God because our uniform and repeated experiences that laws come from lawgivers. Laws come from minds that create them. So the laws that govern our universe and hold everything together must have come from a mind that created them. And the theist deduces that that mind is God. The theist deduces that the most rational explanation for the origination of these laws is a mind that preexists them. A mindless universe cannot make laws and keep them constant. An infinite mind, the mind of God, in contrast, easily can make and sustain laws. A God seems to be a more logical explanation than a blind, mindless, unguided process. The reason atheists make this irrational jump is not because they are following the evidence where it leads, but is because they want to escape accountability for their sins against this eternal God. We all do it, to one extent or another, before we trust Christ. Next, Shermer says, at the time of the scientific revolution, in some countries it was against the law to not be Christian. Therefore, the Christians had to lead these disciplines. Shermer says atheism isn't anything else other than a lack of belief in a God. Shermer says there is no atheist worldview. In response, I'd like to say that it's a misnomer to assert that it was against the law to not be a Christian. So I did a Google search on that claim, and here's the AI overview response. It says it was not illegal not to be a Christian during the period of the Roman Empire, despite some instances of persecution. While the Roman Empire eventually adopted Christianity as its official religion, there were periods of persecution against Christians before and during this transition. However, it was not a blanket law prohibiting Christian religions. Here's a more detailed breakdown. It says there was early persecution. The Roman Empire initially viewed Christianity as a disruptive foreign cult, leading to localized persecution, particularly during the reigns of emperors like Nero. Next, there was the Edict of Serdica. This edict, issued in 311 by the Roman Emperor Galerius, officially ended the persecution of Christianity in the East. So we have to be careful. Some atheists say outrageous things that many times are untrue. These untrue things cause people to come to wrong conclusions about Christianity, and I think that's what Shermer's done here, and this is dangerous. Also, we see that Christians have led the way in the scientific disciplines. Much has been said about this. There's an excerpt from an interview between John Lennox and Eric Metaxas in which Lennox addresses this. Also, in Metaxas' book, Is Atheism Dead?, chapters 26 and 29, has more to say about this. It's my conviction that many atheists misrepresent scientific history to make their case. There's the thumbnails to those videos on my channel. Next, Shermer says that atheism isn't anything else other than a lack of belief in a God. Shermer says there's no atheist worldview. This doesn't seem accurate to me. It seems to be more of a deliberate intent not to let a divine foot in the door. It seems to be a blind faith in science and reason that skeptics practice and propagate, while skeptics accuse Christians of having blind faith in God. It seems to be less passive than a mere lack of belief in God. Instead, it seems more militant and incendiary, like an active campaign against belief in any God. It seems like a misrepresentation of history and science with the goal of creating disciples based on the lies they purport. People like Shermer need to be called to the carpet because they mislead multitudes and cause them to refuse to consider the evidence for theism in Christianity because they create a bias against God in their audience that they elicit by their misrepresentations. Theirs is a worldview that exercises science of the gaps to explain away several things that theists reasonably posit God can account for. Shermer says atheism is not a worldview. I believe he's being disingenuous, or at least just missing that it is a worldview. It's a worldview that champions science and misleads people into thinking we no longer need God because we've replaced God with science. For more on how atheism meets the qualifications for being considered a worldview, please see the following video on my channel. Next, Shermer says the burden of proof is on theists to prove God's existence, not on atheists to disprove God's existence. The atheist can reduce the probability for belief in a God by the cumulative evidence against there being a God. There is no atheist hypothesis. Either you think there's evidence for a God or you do not. All theistic arguments look similar. As has been explained elsewhere on this channel and by more experienced apologists than me, theists can appeal to many lines of reasoning and arrive at the conclusion that the best explanation for the existence of certain things exists because there must be a God. There are multiple lines of circumstantial evidence that seem to strongly point to this unavoidable conclusion. At least the conclusion is unavoidable as long as one is willing to examine the evidence objectively. Some of the multiple lines of circumstantial evidence are the following. First, that scientific data points to the universe having a beginning rather than being eternal. The existence of absolute, objective moral values and duties. The apparent fine-tuning of various life-permitting constants that have to remain constant, otherwise life could not exist. Question about the origin of information that's required for life to exist. The sufficiency for natural selection to explain how to get life from non-life. The fact that various things seem to happen that defy natural order, otherwise known as miracles. There are some other videos on my channel that go into more detail about those things. And that is the purpose of this channel and other YouTube channels like this from other Christian content makers. We show that a robust cumulative case can be made that Christianity is historical, evidential, and, yes, scientific. If one honestly follows the evidence where it leads, they can safely turn from their atheism to the Christ of Christianity and believe because of the evidence, not in spite of the evidence. Shermer says because theists can't think of a natural explanation for something, they default to a theistic explanation. In the long history of science, Shermer says this keeps happening. As science progresses, Shermer says they discover answers to things that they previously did not know. That is what science does. Science keeps filling in the gaps in our knowledge, Shermer says. Eventually, Shermer says there will be no more gaps to fill. When science fills all the gaps, there will be no more need for faith. Shermer appears to do here what atheists regularly do to theists. Atheists regularly accuse theists of appealing to God of the gaps to fill in the gaps of their knowledge. In fact, atheists say, because theists don't understand how things are the way they are, the theist says, I don't know, but I don't have to know because God knows everything and I don't have to. But to me, Shermer himself seems to do the same thing here that he accuses theists of doing. Shermer appeals to science of the gaps by saying, in effect, just because science hasn't discovered something now doesn't mean that science won't discover it in the future. In addition to this being a science of the gap statement, it's also a statement based on faith. Shermer's expressing faith in the scientific enterprise that it will answer questions that are still, as yet, unanswered. And that's a reasonable thing to believe, that science will keep discovering things out, because it does. I don't deny that. I just say that it doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. The advances of science doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, or that there is no need for God. It seems inconsistent and hypocritical to me for atheists like Shermer to criticize theists for taking an approach while giving atheists like himself the liberty to take the same approach. It seems inconsistent and hypocritical to me for atheists like Shermer to criticize theists for taking the God of the gaps approach while giving atheists like himself the benefit of the doubt for taking the science of the gaps approach. Some Christians talk about the return of Christ and how he will return to set right all that is wrong with the world. This approach by Shermer sounds in ways a lot like the approach that some Christians take to the return of Christ. While the Christian believes Christ will return and set things right, people like Shermer believe science will set things right in the world. Both positions require faith, yet skeptics like Shermer appear to fail to see that this position also requires faith, just like my position requires faith. Shermer says if you invoke the God hypothesis, any being who could create all that there is cannot be simple. Any such being must be complex, as or more complex than whatever was created. Because of this complexity, the God of Christianity must be created. Shermer appears to me to be making assumptions with this statement. He appears to be making a philosophical statement based on opinion and framing it as though it is a fact for his unassuming, undiscerning listeners. The God the Christian believes in shares characteristics with the universe on the atheist worldview. Our God is eternal and outside of time. If our God has the power to create, of course he must be more complex than anything he creates. If he were not more complex in his creation, how could he uphold it and sustain it? He could not uphold and sustain a creation more complex than he. But the God of Christianity is more powerful than his creation. Therefore, he's more complex than his creation. God therefore meets the conditions set upon him by Shermer and need not be created. Shermer says the biggest problem for theists is the problem of evil. God is all powerful. God is all good. Evil exists. Shermer says you can have two of those, but you can't have all three. Shermer gives many real-life examples of how suffering in the world is an argument against God's existence. Shermer says science can be the solution to the problems because science can supply the things to help end suffering. Shermer says religion says suffering is part of God's plan. Shermer asks why God, who's all-powerful and all good, would not stop gratuitous suffering. Shermer says for God not to stop suffering suggests God is not all-powerful, not all good, or does not exist at all. Shermer may or may not be right that the theist's biggest issue is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is definitely not something that should be overlooked and ignored. The problem of evil needs to be carefully and compassionately considered. There are various theodicies. Many wise Christians have made astute observations with relation to this sensitive topic. Questions I would have for people like Shermer who raise this valid concern is why would God need to bring end to evil? Why does God not bringing an end to evil in this way make God a moral monster? Why does suffering not have to have a purpose? The atheist fails to realize that this world's not our home. It's not supposed to be perfect here on earth. If it were perfect here on earth, we would have no reason to long for our heavenly home. If this earth were perfect, we would have become more wrapped up, more than we already are, in this life and have no concern whatsoever about the next life. There are many people who already live this way. There are many people who already live like this life is all there is, and there's no reason to be concerned about any life to come. What if we are comparing our definitions for good to the wrong object? What if this earth that God has cursed because of our sin cannot be the ultimate definition of good because we have made it the way that it is? What if the perfect world people like Shermer think science is working on to bring us will never be possible even as science advances? What if science is never going to be able to bring the perfection that people like Shermer talk about? Shermer's making philosophical, faith-based statements about science that have similarities to philosophical, faith-based statements made by theists. Why can't atheists recognize this? What if the problem of evil and suffering in this life on this earth is never supposed to be solved? What if evil and suffering is always supposed to exist until Christ returns, so his bride, the church, can be his hands and feet around the world while we wait for his return? What if Christ's bride, the church, is supposed to use the tools that modern science provides to be his hands and feet as they go into all the world and preach the gospel? What if it is God and science rather than God or science? What if modern science is a viable defense weapon against disease and other forms of evil? What if suffering exists in part because the fortunate, like you listening and me speaking, in affluent societies are too consumed in our own lives and oblivious to the suffering to be active in being part of the solution to the suffering Shermer describes? Don't hear me as criticizing Shermer or atheists for being selfish. Theists can also be selfish. Theists just call such selfishness sin and acknowledge they need to be forgiven for such sinful selfishness. Shermer says when good things happen, theists give God credit. Shermer says when bad things happen, theists don't blame God or they blow it away by saying God works in mysterious ways. Therefore, Shermer says, whether good happens or bad happens, the God hypothesis is confirmed. I think my previous response to Shermer addressed this portion of Shermer's opening statement as well. Bad things happen because we sin by rejecting God in the myriad ways that we do. Even the people who have never heard the name of Christ sin when they worship parts of the creation rather than the Creator who's revealed himself to them through creation and conscience. God does not send people to hell because of what they don't know. In other words, God does not send people to hell who never heard of Christ. God does not send people to hell who reject the knowledge they do understand about him. God does send people to hell who reject the knowledge they do understand about him, not the knowledge they don't understand about him. Yes, God does judge people and even uses human instruments or natural evil to demonstrate that. Interestingly, God also uses human instruments and natural evil to demonstrate his love as well. God demonstrated his love by using people to meet needs. God demonstrates his love through non-human parts of his creation. Things like pets, good food, a sunrise, and other parts of his creation to show us that we need to be thankful. We just need to be careful to direct our thanks to the right object, the God who gives us life in these things and created and sustains the universe and everything and everyone in it, including you and me. Shermer asks what would disconfirm the God hypothesis. He says that nothing can refute it for theists. He says that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Shermer makes up this dragon example and tries to strawman theists by substituting a dragon for God. He basically made the point with the dragon example that many of the things that theists credit God for are things science eventually has figured out or will figure out. Shermer said faith in a God is like playing baseball without the bases or without the ball. Theists can say the same thing to atheists that Shermer just said. Theists can say to atheists that the atheist will claim that just because science has not figured out something does not mean that science will never figure that thing out. This is science of the gaps. Nothing can disconfirm this for the atheist, because neither the theist or atheist will live to see everything get discovered, so both the atheist and the theist need to live their worldview based on faith. Both will say that evidence supports their faith. The atheist strawmans the theist by saying the theist believes without evidence. The theist should believe because of the evidence. Atheists who trust in science like theists who trust in God can make the same argument for science that a theist can make for God. The atheist can look to the past and see how science has advanced and helped countless people and predict based on that science will continue to help people moving forward. The Christian can point to episodes in their lives and in the lives of others, some tangible and some intangible, where God has demonstrated to them and others himself in powerful ways. For the Christian, this counts as evidence, but it is not the only evidence that is available for the Christian or non-Christian to experience. I will speak for myself when I say that My faith in Christ is not at all similar to Shermer's analogy of playing baseball without the bases or without the ball. In his illustrations, the participants trying to play the game without all the necessary equipment. Both the theist and the atheist have the same equipment at their disposal. Both the theist and the atheist have the same data from which to work. They just interpret the data differently. I don't think Shermer's illustration applies. Shermer says this is like the witch theory of causality. If your explanation for natural evil is the witch theory of causality, that women cavort with demons, then you lived 500 years ago. He cites Exodus 22, verse 18, a command to kill witches. Today, no one believes this because science has debunked the witch theory of causality, as it's been debunking all these religious theories of causality. I think Shermer here is doing what a lot of atheists do and cherry-picking a wild example that nobody believes today and lumping everyone else in with the bad example that he's chosen. I could do the same thing that Shermer does and say that because people used science to believe that having sick blood sucked out of the body by leeches, because that was the common scientific opinion of that day, like there are many common scientific opinions today that need to be updated and are updated. Since that scientific opinion was later proven wrong and modern scientific opinions are constantly being revised and updated, should we reject science altogether? Say no? I would say no. Science on a whole is still very good for a lot of things, for which it is intended. Science on a whole is still very good for a lot of things, for which it is intended. There are some things science is not meant to address. As science is imperfect, so all religions are imperfect. That is why no religion should be trusted. Only Christ is perfect God and is worthy of our trust. Michael Jones has a YouTube channel that contains a video that explains how the Old Testament law that has commands like the one Shermer cited about killing witches was never intended to be the perfect moral standard by which all societies for all time should base their morality. You should check Jones's full response out in his video. Shermer infers that because religion has no method for testing hypotheses, it's not worthy of our trust. Religion is the invisible dragon and nothing more. He says the Christian theory is that bad things happen because of the fall in the Garden of Eden and original sin. He says we are free to sin and do evil. This is another one of those inferences that's based on scientism, the belief that science is the only way to knowledge or truth. By saying what Shermer said, he insinuates that the only way to know something is if it can be verified by using the scientific method. This is a philosophical assertion that's based on subjective opinion rather than objective truth. It's not true in our experience that the only way to know something is by verifying it by running a scientific experiment. I challenge any atheist to explain how they know they love someone. Do they do an experiment? I challenge any atheist to show me the molecule for hate. Can they make that in a lab? There are some things that will never be able to be sufficiently explained by purely scientific means. Shermer caricatures all religions by lumping them all in with the invisible dragon. Here, Shermer makes the mistake many atheists make when they assume that all religions are equal in validity to one another. They assume if they can establish that all religions are the same because some of them share common characteristics with one another, that if they can get one discarded, then they can get all of them discarded because they think on the surface that all religions are the same. Christians point to evidence from history, science, and other fields to show that theirs is not the same as the others. Shermer asks about children with incurable diseases. Where's God in that? He mocks Christians for their response to things like child suffering, when God could have intervened but did not. Is that God not worth trusting? The things Shermer brings up are important, and theists of any stripe should not dismiss them. Anyone, theist or atheist, could point to any variety of suffering that has existed since the dawn of human civilization and object in the manner that Shermer has chosen to object, in the way of observation. On what objective basis, not based on personal opinion, but based on irrefutable fact, can anyone say that it is bad for children to suffer with incurable diseases? If it is always bad for children to suffer from incurable diseases, then there must be an objective moral standard that says that this is bad, that is beyond you and me. If there is no such transcendent standard, then it is nothing more than a matter of opinion that the fact that there are children stricken with incurable diseases is bad. No honest atheist would be bold enough to say that it is not objectively bad for such suffering to exist. For there to be objective bad, there must be objective good. For objective good to exist, there must be an ultimate source of good. The theist can present arguments for why God is the best explanation for that good to which I refer. As for the question of where is God in suffering, I believe I've already given an answer in previous portions of this video. Is the fault with God when God's people don't do what God's people are called to do to help mitigate suffering? No. Is it the fault of God to not stop suffering that the human race has brought upon itself? No. Not all suffering is a direct result of human sin, but I would argue that all suffering is an indirect result of human sin. Suffering and death did not enter the world, biblically speaking, until after sin entered the world through Adam and Eve. So any sin and suffering we or others experience, biblically speaking, can be traced to Adam and Eve and our penchant for following in their footsteps to choose our own way instead of choosing God's way. Shermer misses that God has actually intervened. He sent Christ to take the curse upon himself to fix the relationship we have broken. This world's never supposed to be and was never supposed to be our home. Christians are supposed to be the hands and feet of Christ, meeting needs in their sphere of influence. In doing so, they have the opportunity to demonstrate the love of God as demonstrated through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Shermer says the solution to suffering is to accept the deity's sacrifice to exonerate you. He says you could be a serial killer on death row and find Jesus. He says several serial killers do find Jesus. Are we to believe these killers, if they accept Jesus, that they're allowed to go to heaven while those who are much better than them, who don't accept Jesus, don't go to heaven? He suggests that people who lived before us, before the gospel was spread like it is now, who do not hear Jesus would not get to go to heaven. He says this makes Christianity a cult of human sacrifice. But instead, the sacrifice of Christ was sacrificed, he says. He says the doctrine of original sin by Adam and Eve intimates that we are not responsible for our own sins. He says God could have just forgiven the sin of us, but instead sacrificed himself to himself. He says this violates the law of identity. Shermer says, so God sacrificed to himself to save us from himself. He says this is barking mad. This is not consistent with Christian teaching in the strictest sense. His statement presupposes that the God he is caricaturing is unjust, for it would be unjust for God to send someone to hell merely for not knowing about Jesus. It's easy for Shermer and others like him to strawman Jesus and Christians. The New Testament actually teaches something distinct from what Shermer describes. The New Testament teaches that before Christ came, those who believed in God's promise to send Messiah and believed God by faith received God's imputed righteousness, like Christians who trust Christ receive Christ's righteousness. How does an atheist like Shermer decide what is just and what is unjust? He has no standard of unchanging objective truth to which to point to make such declaration. In order for Shermer to make moral absolute statements or inferences and call the justice of God into question for how God made a way for sinners like Shermer, you and me, to be forgiven, Shermer has to borrow from a theistic worldview and assume that ultimate objective morality and justice exists. That is easier for a theist to do than it is for an atheist to do. The theist can point to an objective transcendent source for justice that an atheist cannot point to. For the atheist, what is just or what is unjust can only be a matter of majority opinion. It is not true that the doctrine of original sin teaches that we are not responsible for our sins. There are nuances to this view. Some think Adam's sin was imputed to our account, and we are therefore guilty because of that. Others think Adam's sin nature, and not any specific sin, was imputed to our account. Regardless of which one of those two options is actually correct, the end result is the same. We all sin. Because we all sin, we all need a Savior. I think I take a mix of the two views. Adam's choice to sin means we inherit a sin nature, therefore we inevitably sin. But Adam is not to blame, we are to blame. Our choice to sin ratifies that we've inherited Adam's nature and that this has led us to choose sin. Our choice to sin, not Adam's choice, condemns us. God could not just forgive the sin, as Shermer claims. Atheists like Shermer like to frequently misrepresent Christian beliefs and strawman Christians and attack the strawman, as Sherman does. Again, here, not the first time he did it in this opening statement. God cannot just forgive sin like Shermer posits. Since the Garden of Eden, sin has always required death as a payment. Everyone dies because everyone sins. Humanity's only hope is to put their faith in the one who rose from the dead, Jesus Christ. Since God is perfect and holy, he cannot allow sin in his presence. This is why he had to look away from Christ on the cross as he poured out his wrath on him. Since Christ is both fully God and fully man, he can be the perfect substitute we all need to receive God's forgiveness and be adopted into God's family. God the Father sent God the Son to earth to hang between earth and heaven, to be the bridge from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. Heaven came down to earth, and so those on earth could go to heaven. Too many details had to be worked out just perfectly for it to be made up or to have happened by mere chance. Too many pieces of circumstantial evidence exist to completely disregard the circumstantial case for the veracity of Christianity. It takes more faith to consider all the evidence cumulatively and dismiss it than it does to humble yourself, admit you've sinned against God, and place your faith in Christ for salvation. Do it today. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.